Hello class and welcome to week 4 of Athletic Finance. This week we're going to look closely at booster clubs, and it will include a study on the different types of options that are out there when you're looking at establishing or maybe changing current booster structure. You have separate sport boosters, which would be booster clubs for individual sports, and then you have a school-wide boosters or a combination of the two. In this time, I want to share some of my experiences and thoughts on those experiences um, based on a school-wide boosters and some of the problems that I think are important to recognize when you have separate sport boosters. I also want to take some time to share some thoughts on strategic planning as it relates to the setup or organization of a booster club. So let's take some time to do that now. First, let's look at separate booster problems. These four areas were taken from the article In It Together by Michael McCollum and Melanie Craig. They pointed out that when booster clubs are separate, inequities among all sports can and do occur. In my experience, I've seen this in the baseball and softball programs. Our baseball program is much stronger than our softball program in terms of the parent support, so they're able to generate the resources much more easily than the softball program. So this can lead obviously to an inequity when you look at the facility that they have, the uniforms they wear, the batting cages, all of those things that are necessary to run a successful program. The next area is that separate clubs breed unhealthy competition for dollars within the community. This is often seen with the spring sports, since they happen last in the school year, and usually this is an area that is affected by advertising. The sports in the fall, like football, go out and solicit advertising from the businesses, and so by the time the spring sports get around, they obviously experience a little more problem or issues with getting support at that time of year. The third area is that multiple clubs make it more difficult to track money, and with this, embezzlement chances are much higher. That's why it's important to make sure you have the mechanisms in place that help you avoid embezzlement. But when you have separate boosters, it just makes it much more difficult on the part of the athletic director to try and track this and keep up with the different changes that are occurring in these separate sports clubs. And lastly, Title IX compliance is difficult to achieve and maintain with separate boosters, which leads to potential loss of federal funding for school districts if there is a problem with regard to complying with Title IX. Some things that I wanted to mention that I've experienced specifically are school district communication is one, and that relates to mandates that come down from our school district and how you communicate that to the separate clubs. When we had the ACLU lawsuit that came down with regard to fees, it was much easier for schools that had a school-wide booster to communicate these mandates and the rules and the policy changes versus schools that had separate booster clubs for their different sports. Oversight by an athletic director is more difficult. I kind of mentioned this already. When you look at websites that different booster clubs have, the forms they use, and if they're following the correct language and protocol required by the school district, also attending meetings becomes problematic. So all this puts a strain on an athletic director. Coaches usually prefer their separate booster club because they do have more autonomy and can make the decisions regarding where to spend their money and how they want to fundraise. However, that does make it more difficult for an athletic director. There's also a power struggle that I've experienced over the years, and that is usually in relation to parents who raise a certain amount of money, usually large sums of money, and how they view themselves within the school and the athletic department or within a sport, sometimes leading to conflict between parents and coaches and conflict with the school in terms of who they hire and who's involved in the hiring process. So I think hiring influence is another area that's problematic with separate boosters. looking at the problems with separate sports boosters, I want to look at some suggestions if you're looking to establish a school-wide boosters, or at least consider the different perspective of a school-wide boosters. That's not to say that separate sports boosters don't offer some positives. I just believe, in my experience, that there's a much higher chance for success when you have a school-wide boosters. So the first thing you need to look at when establishing a school-wide boosters is to get coach and parent buy-in. You need to help coaches see how it can help them as much as possible. They sometimes want to look at how this is going to take away from their fundraising ability, and so trying to paint a picture that can help them see the benefits of a school-wide boosters is important. Also, helping them to recognize that working together will be more beneficial in the long run. Often coaches see the short-term results as a problem, and in the long run, when you consider the things that can be accomplished by a school-wide booster, there's a lot more opportunity for success. And so offering up-to-date information is important in that process. Having a website or at least a page on your athletic website or a booster website that is easy to navigate and includes the information that coaches and parents would need as you go about the process of setting this up or changing what you may currently have. Some other suggestions that I have are to set a clear structure and explanation for fundraising. This is something that I had to experience through some adversity and failure over the years, but the more clear you are, the better it is for your school-wide boosters. And that would apply to how you sell apparel, what the process is for selling advertising as a fundraising, concessions in your sports, how would you go about purchasing big ticket items, facility upgrades, membership in the boosters and what that includes, and then the events. Like, for example, at our school right now, we have two major fundraising events for our school-wide boosters, and that's a golf tournament and Christmas cheese sales. That doesn't mean that there aren't other opportunities to establish events either for the booster itself or for individual sports. It just means that we try and limit it as much as possible, the events throughout the year, and also make sure that they're not in conflict with each other, because that obviously breeds unhealthy competition, which I mentioned previously. Another suggestion is to set clear roles for booster board members and communicate your expectations. It's really important that you develop trust with individuals on the booster board and parents that are influential during this process. Building consensus for the ideas you may have is important, and often I would go about this with sharing ideas that I had with individuals who I had developed trust in, and letting them help me to communicate my goals and my vision for our booster club. It's always important to monitor this closely, because with relationships and different personalities within a school, it's easy to have miscommunications, and this is probably one of the biggest areas that I've experienced in terms of failure over the years, and that's people perceiving things that we do not as accurately as I intended. So monitoring it closely and keeping in close contact with the important individuals is important. Also, revisiting policies, procedures, and also the strategic plan regularly is important. Otherwise, as you have change in booster board members, those people don't realize what the original intention of the boosters was in the first place. So let's look at another suggestion, and that is the strategic plan or the setup of a booster constitution. Four key areas are necessary in this area, and that is mission and vision, electing officers, financial procedures, and that includes budgeting, how money is to be spent, how transactions will be made, deposits, and check requests, and then lastly, mechanisms to avoid embezzlement. And Michael Popke wrote a really good article in the Athletic Business magazine called Booster Club Guidelines Guard Against Embezzlement, which I included in the assignment folder this week. Another suggestion is having team reps and volunteers included, and having a process set up for those individuals who are willing to take or volunteer in these areas. It is something that we did not do in the beginning, but we do now, is to have mandatory trainings that helps to bring the team reps and volunteers up to date on how those procedures should be followed when you're making deposits, engaging in different fundraising activities as individual sports, as well as within the Booster Club itself. Educating parents is important on what the requirements are for those positions, and also what the role is for the coach and the athletic director within the Booster Club. And then lastly, to have a volunteer plan, and that is to make sure you have the easy communication structure, and that would include email distribution lists, communicating the benefits of volunteering and how that's going to help their sport. Those are important areas to include as well. In relation to booster organizations and the establishment of a booster club, I do want to talk about types of change in organizations, because I think it lends itself to this discussion. I also want to mention the characteristics of a transformational organization and the process of a slow death, with which Robert Quinn describes in his book Deep Change. First, developmental change is the simplest type of change, and it comes with the lowest risk. Usually you see small shifts in the environment when you go through developmental change, and improvement is within the box, which means it is applied to what is already known or practiced. Transitional change takes an organization from an old state through a transition phase to a completely new state. Usually the outcome is known or can be predicted and can be measured. It replaces what is with something entirely different, and it's also good when people issues are not the dominant problem. Lastly, and probably the most difficult to enact, is transformational change. And this is where the future is unknown at the beginning, so it requires discovery and trial and error. There's a shift in mindset necessary. The organizing principles of the organization, the behavior, the culture of an organization are all key in that part of it. And then also human and cultural issues are key drivers. If you look at the schematic on the left of the screen, you can see in any organization you have the birth and a immediate growth phase of an organization, followed by a success plateau. And at that point in the lifespan of organizations, you experience certain forms of chaos that either cause you to re-emerge, and these serve as wake-up calls along the way, or you spiral towards organizational death. So it's our job as leaders in athletic departments and coaches, whether you're an athletic director or a head coach, or maybe a administrator one day, to take that information and apply it to our immediate situation. In this case, with booster clubs, the characteristics of a transformational organization include one that considers its vision, which means where it's going, and helps to give hope and perspective. Also, its mission, what its purpose is, what it stands for, how it gets things done, and this should contain timeless values and take advantage of timely opportunities. You can see how those flow in and out of a transformational organization, both vision and mission. Next, it also considers organizational design, which includes the structure that enables the mission. A couple quotes here illustrate this perfectly, and that is, your system is perfectly designed to yield the results you are getting. Or, if you continue to think as you've always thought, you will continue to get what you have always gotten. And both quotes illustrate the fact that Whatever organization we are part of, the mechanisms and structure within that organization usually determine the result. And that could be a positive result or a negative result. It could be good organizational behavior or negative organizational behavior. And I think those parts that you can see on the illustration here of a transformation organization, which includes its vision and mission, but also includes its organizational design, and lastly, the relationships, which are the quality of the inter and intrapersonal relationships. All of those things go into forming a transformational organization. Often we find ourselves in a situation where it feels like there's nothing that can be accomplished of significance, or a feeling of being trapped and unable to enact significant change in an organization. And Robert Quinn would call this a slow death, which is an alternative organizational phenomenon of doing nothing. The process of a slow death includes a pervasiveness culture, one that isn't willing to rock the boat, where change is needed but denied because competent, well-intentioned people have opted for the slow death. This illustrates the choice that we all make within our organizations to either improve and change or allow what's been happening to continue. Number two, the violation of trust and responsibility makes issues undiscussable. Number three, a thirst for vision. And usually people know when critical issues are ignored, and consequently they lose hope and feel trapped. The only way to cope with this is by either keeping busy or by withdrawing. And lastly, related to this, few people are good at reinventing themselves, so they stay busy, which is not very effective except as a narcotic. So the logic of task pursuit describes the busyness that we sometimes engage in to avoid the problems that are really at the root of our organization. This would be equated to cutting wood under pressure and not sharpening the saw. Every organization has a group of systems, be it cultural, strategic, technical, or political. In an environment of change, each of these systems, like the saw, tends to wear down, and alignment within and between the systems is lost. We often find ourselves working harder than ever, yet we benefit less and less from our efforts. As tensions mount, we look for someone else to blame. And the real problem is embedded in the underlying organizational systems that have shifted out of alignment or may have never been aligned properly in the first place with each other and sometimes with the external environment. Doing the right thing is driven out by the need to be busy, and this is what he refers to as the tyranny of the urgent. As I close this week, I'd like to encourage you to reflect on the things that I discussed today, and hopefully it can provide you some direction as you begin your research for your essay this week on setting up a booster club. Hopefully you can take the articles that I've included and glean as much information as possible. Don't be afraid to use me as a resource along the way as well. There are more than one way to establish a booster club, and there are definitely appropriate times when a separate boosters might be the best way to go. I just feel that if you're an athletic director and you want to make the most impact on an athletic department and a school, that a school-wide boosters is the best course of action. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to seeing your work this week.